of Lord Arthur Savile's Crime of Section 2 by Oscar Wilde. When Lord Arthur woke, it was 12 o'clock, and the midday sun was streaming through the ivory silk curtains of his room. He got up and looked out of the window. A dim haze of heat was hanging over the great city, and the roofs of the houses were like dull silver. In the flickering green of the square below, some children were flitting about like white butterflies, and the pavement was crowded with people on their way to the park. Never had life seemed lovelier to him. Never had the things of evil seemed more remote. Then his valet brought him a cup of chocolate on a tray. After he had drunk it, he drew aside a heavy portiere of peach-colored plush and passed into the bathroom. The light stole softly from above, through fence slabs of transparent onyx, and the water in the marble tank glimmered like a moonstone. He plunged hastily in, till the cool ripples touched throat and hair, and then dipped his head right under, as though he would have wiped away the stain of some shameful memory. When he stepped out, he felt almost at peace. The exquisite physical conditions of the moment had dominated him, as indeed often happens in the case of very finely wrought natures, for the senses, like fire, can purify as well as destroy. After breakfast, he flung himself down on a divan and lit a cigarette. On the mantel-shelf, framed in dainty old brocade, stood a large photograph of Sybil Merton, as he had seen her first at Lady Noel's ball. The small, exquisitely shaped head drooped slightly to one side, as though the thin reed-like throat could hardly bear the burden of so much beauty. The lips were slightly parted, and seemed made for sweet music, and all the tender purity of girlhood looked out in wonder from the dreaming eyes. With her soft clinging dress of crêpe de chine, and her large leaf-shaped fan, she looked like one of those delicate little figures men find in the olive woods near Tanagra, and there was a touch of Greek grace in her pose and attitude. Yet she was not petite. She was simply perfectly proportioned, a rare thing in an age when so many women are either over life-size or insignificant. Now, as Lord Arthur looked at her, he was filled with the terrible pity that is born of love. He felt that to marry her, with the doom of murder hanging over his head, would be a betrayal like that of Judas, a sin worse than any the Borgias had ever dreamed of. What happiness could there be for them when at any moment he might be called upon to carry out the awful prophecy written in his hand? What manner of life would be theirs while fate still held this fearful fortune in the scales? The marriage must be postponed at all costs. Of this he was quite resolved. Ardently, though he loved the girl, and a mere touch of her fingers, when they sat together, made each nerve of his body thrill with exquisite joy, he recognized none the less clearly where his duty lay, and was fully conscious of the fact that he had no right to marry until he had committed the murder. This done, he could stand before the altar with Sybil Merton, and give his life into her hands without terror of wrongdoing. This done, he could take her to his arms, knowing that she would never have to blush for him, never have to hang her head in shame. But done it must be first, and the sooner the better, for both. Many men in his position would have preferred the primrose path of dalliance to the steep heights of duty. But Lord Arthur was too conscientious to set pleasure above principle. There was more than mere passion in his love, and Sybil was to him a symbol of all that is good and noble. For a moment he had a natural repugnance against what he was asked to do, but it soon passed away. His heart told him that it was not a sin, but a sacrifice. His reason reminded him that there was no other course open. He had to choose between living for himself and living for others, and terrible though the task laid upon him undoubtedly was, yet he knew that he must not suffer selfishness to triumph over love. Sooner or later, we are all called upon to decide on the same issue. Of us all, the same question is asked. To Lord Arthur, it came early in life, before his nature had been spoiled by the calculating cynicism of middle age, or his heart corroded by the shallow, fashionable egotism of our day. and he felt no hesitation about doing his duty. Fortunately also for him, he was no mere dreamer or idle dilettante. Had he been so, he would have hesitated, like Hamlet, and let irresolution mar his purpose. But he was essentially practical. Life to him meant action, rather than thought. He had that rarest of all things, common sense. The wild, turbid feelings of the previous night had by this time completely passed away, and it was almost with a sense of shame that he looked back upon his mad wanderings from street to street, his fierce emotional agony. The very sincerity of his sufferings made them seem unreal to him now. He wondered how he could have been so foolish as to rant and rave about the inevitable. The only question that seemed to trouble him was whom to make away with, for he was not blind to the fact that murder, like the religions of the pagan world, requires a victim as well as a priest. Not being a genius, he had no enemies, and indeed he felt that this was not the time for the gratification of any personal pique or dislike, the mission in which he was engaged being one of great and grave solemnity. He accordingly made out a list of his friends and relatives on a sheet of notepaper, and after careful consideration decided in favor of Lady Clementina Beauchamp, a dear old lady who lived in Curzon Street, and was his own second cousin by his mother's side. He had always been very fond of Lady Clem, as everyone called her, and as he was very wealthy himself, having come into all Lord Rothes' property when he came of age, there was no possibility of his deriving any vulgar monetary advantage by her death. In fact, the more he thought over the matter, the more she seemed to him to be just the right person, and, feeling that any delay would be unfair to Sybil, he determined to make his arrangements at once. The first thing to be done was, of course, to settle with the chiromantist. So he sat down at a small Sheraton writing table that stood near a window, drew a cheque for £105, payable to the order of Mr Septimus Podgers, and, enclosing it in an envelope, told his valet to take it to West Moon Street. He then telephoned to the stables for his hansom, and dressed to go out. As he was leaving the room, he looked back at Sybil Morton's photograph, and swore that, come what may, he would never let her know what he was doing for her sake, but would keep the secret of his self-sacrifice hidden always in his heart. On his way to the Buckingham, he stopped at the florist's and sent Sybil a beautiful basket of narcissus, with lovely white petals and staring pheasant's eyes, and, on arriving at the club, went straight to the library, rang the bell, and ordered the waiter to bring him a lemon and soda, and a book on toxicology. He had fully decided that poison was the best means to adopt in this troublesome business. Anything like personal violence was extremely distasteful to him, and besides, he was very anxious not to murder Lady Clementina in any way that might attract public attention, as he hated the idea of being lionized at Lady Windermere's, or seeing his name figuring in the paragraphs of vulgar society newspapers. He had also to think of Sybil's father and mother, who were rather old-fashioned people, and might possibly object to the marriage if there was anything like a scandal, though he felt certain that if he told them the whole facts of the case, they would be the very first to appreciate the motives that had actuated him. He had every reason, then, to decide in favor of poison. It was safe, sure, and quiet, and did away with any necessity for painful scenes to which, like most Englishmen, he had a rooted objection. Of the science of poisons, however, he knew absolutely nothing, and as the waiter seemed quite unable to find anything in the library but Ruff's Guide and Bailey's Magazine, he examined the bookshelves himself, and finally came across a handsomely bound edition of the Pharmacopoeia, and a copy of Erskine's Toxicology, edited by Sir Matthew Reed, the President of the Royal College of Physicians, and one of the oldest members of the Buckingham, having been elected in mistake for somebody else, a contretemps that so enraged the committee that when the real man came up, they blackballed him unanimously. Lord Orford was a good deal puzzled at the technical terms used in both books, and had begun to regret that he had not paid more attention to his classics at Oxford, when in a second volume of Erskine he found a very interesting and complete account of the properties of aconitine, written in fairly clear English. It seemed to him to be exactly the poison he wanted. It was swift, indeed, almost immediate in its effect, perfectly painless, and when taken in the form of a gelatin capsule, the mode recommended by Sir Matthew, not by any means unpalatable. He accordingly made a note upon his shirt cuff of the amount necessary for a fatal dose, put the books back in their places, and strolled up St. James's Street to Pestle and Humby's, the great chemists. Mr. Pestle, who always attended personally on the aristocracy, was a good deal surprised at the order, and in a very deferential manner murmured something about a medical certificate being necessary. However, as soon as Lord Arthur explained to him that it was for a large Norwegian mastiff that he was obliged to get rid of, as it showed signs of incipient rabies, and had already bitten the coachman twice in the calf of the leg, he expressed himself as being perfectly satisfied, complimented Lord Arthur on his wonderful knowledge of psychology, and had the prescription made up immediately. Lord Arthur put the capsule into a pretty little silver bonbonniere that he saw in a shop window in Bond Street, threw away Pastor and Humby's ugly pill-box, and drove off at once to Lady Clementina's. "Well, Monsieur le Mauvais Sujet," cried the old lady as he entered the room, "why haven't you been to see me all this time?" "My dear Lady Clem, I never have a moment to myself," said Lord Arthur, smiling. "I suppose you mean that you go out all day long with Miss Sybil Merton, buying chiffons and talking nonsense. I cannot understand why people make such a fuss about being married. In my day we never dreamed of billing and cooing in public, or in private for that matter. I assure you I have not seen Sybil for 24 hours, Lady Clem. As far as I can make out, she belongs entirely to her millionaires. Of course, that is the only reason you come to see an ugly old woman like myself. I wonder you men don't take warning. On a fête de folie pour moi. And here I am, a poor rheumatic creature, with a false front and a bad temper. Why, if it were not for dear Lady Jansen, who sends me all the worst French novels she can find, I don't think I could get food a day. Doctors are no use at all, except to get fees out of one. They can't even cure my heartburn." "I have brought you a cure for that, Lady Clem," said Lord Arthur gravely. "It is a wonderful thing, invented by an American." "I don't think I like American inventions, Arthur. I am quite sure I don't. I read some American novels lately, and they were quite nonsensical." "Oh, but there is no nonsense at all about this, Lady Clem. I assure you it is a perfect cure. You must promise to try it." And Lord Arthur brought a little box out of his pocket and handed it to her. "Well, the box is charming, Arthur. Is it really a present?" "That is very sweet of you. And is this the wonderful medicine? It looks like a bonbon. I'll take it at once." "Good heavens, Lady Clem," cried Lord Arthur, catching hold of her hand. "You mustn't do anything of the kind. It is a homeopathic medicine, and if you take it without having heartburn, it might do you no end of harm. Wait till you have an attack, and take it then. You will be astonished at the result." "I should like to take it now," said Lady Clementina, holding up to the light the little transparent capsule with its floating bubble of liquid aconitine. "I am sure it is delicious. The fact is that, though I hate doctors, I love medicines. However, I'll keep it till my next attack." "And when will that be?" asked Lord Arthur eagerly. "Will it be soon?" "I hope not for a week. I had a very bad time yesterday morning with it, but one never knows." "You are sure to have one before the end of the month, then, Lady Clem?" "I am afraid so, but how sympathetic you are today, Arthur. Really, Sybil has done you a great deal of good, and now you must run away, for I am dining with some very dull people, who won't talk scandal, and I know that if I don't get my sleep now, I shall never be able to keep awake during dinner. Goodbye, Arthur. Give my love to Sybil, and thank you so much for the American medicine." "You won't forget to take it, Lady Clem, will you?" said Lord Arthur, rising from his seat. "Of course I won't, you silly boy. I think it is most kind of you to think of me, and I shall write and tell you if I want any more." Lord Arthur left the house in high spirits, and with a feeling of immense relief. That night he had an interview with Sybil Merton. He told her how he had suddenly been placed in a position of terrible difficulty, from which neither honor nor duty would allow him to recede. He told her that the marriage must be put off for the present, as until he had got rid of his fearful entanglements, he was not a free man. He implored her to trust him, and not to have any doubts about the future. Everything would come right, but patience was necessary. The scene took place in the conservatory of Mr. Merton's house in Park Lane, where Lord Arthur had dined as usual. Sybil had never seemed more happy, and for a moment Lord Arthur had been tempted to play the coward's part, to write to Lady Clementina for the pill, and to let the marriage go on, as if there was no such person as Mr. Podgers in the world. His better nature, however, soon asserted itself, and even when Sybil flung herself weeping into his arms, he did not falter. The beauty that stirred his senses had touched his conscience also. He felt that to wreck so fair a life for the sake of a few months' pleasure would be a wrong thing to do. He stayed with Sybil till nearly midnight, comforting her and being comforted in turn, and early the next morning he left for Venice, after writing a manly, firm letter to Mr. Merton about the necessary postponement of the marriage. Chapter 4. In Venice he met his brother, Lord Surbiton, who happened to have come over from Corfu in his yacht. The two young men spent a delightful fortnight together. In the morning they rowed on the Leto, or glided up and down the green canals in their long black gondola. In the afternoon they usually entertained visitors on the yacht, and in the evening they dined at Florian's and smoked innumerable cigarettes on the piazza. Yet somehow Lord Arthur was not happy. Every day he studied the obituary in the Times, expecting to see a notice of Lady Clementina's death, but every day he was disappointed. He began to be afraid that some accident had happened to her, and often regretted that he had prevented her taking the aconite when she had been so anxious to try its effect. Sybil's letters, too, though full of love and trust and tenderness, were often very sad in their tone, and sometimes he used to think that he was parted from her forever. After a fortnight, Lord Surbiton got bored with Venice, and determined to run down the coast to Ravenna, as he heard that there was some capital cock-shooting in the Pine-Eton. Lord Arthur at first refused absolutely to come, but Surbiton, of whom he was extremely fond, finally persuaded him that if he stayed at Danieli's by himself, he would be mobbed to death. And on the morning of the 15th, they started with a strong northeast wind blowing, and a rather choppy sea. The sport was excellent, and a free open-air life brought the colour back to Lord Arthur's cheek. But about the 22nd, he became anxious about Lady Clementina, and, in spite of Surbiton's remonstrances, came back to Venice by train. As he stepped out of the gondola onto the hotel steps, the proprietor came forward to meet him with a sheaf of telegrams. Lord Arthur snatched them out of his hand and tore them open. Everything had been successful. Lady Clementina had died quite suddenly on the night of the 17th. His first fault was for Sybil, and he sent her off a telegram announcing his immediate return to London. He then ordered his valet to pack his things for the night mail, sent his gondoliers about 5 times their proper fare, and ran up to his sitting room with a light step and a buoyant heart. There he found 3 letters waiting for him. One was from Sybil herself, full of sympathy and condolence. The others were from his mother, and from Lady Clementina's solicitor. It seemed that the old lady had dined with the Duchess that very night, had delighted everyone by her wit and esprit, but had gone home somewhat early, complaining of heartburn. Sir Matthew Reed had been sent for at once, but, of course, there was nothing to be done, and she was to be buried on the 22nd at Beecham, Chalcot. A few days before she died, she had made her will and left Lord Arthur her little house in Curzon Street, and all her furniture, personal effects, and pictures, with the exception of her collection of miniatures, which was to go to her sister, Lady Margaret Rufford, and her amethyst necklace, which Sybil Merton was to have. The property was not of much value, but Mr. Mansfield, the solicitor, was extremely anxious for Lord Orford to return at once, if possible, as there were a great many bills to be paid, and Lady Clementina had never kept any regular accounts. Lord Arthur was very touched by Lady Clementina's kind remembrance of him, and he felt that Mr. Podgers had a great deal to answer for. His love of Sybil, however, dominated every other emotion, and the consciousness that he had done his duty gave him peace and comfort. When he arrived at Charing Cross, he felt perfectly happy. The Mertons received him very kindly. Sybil made him promise that he would never again allow anything to come between them, and the marriage was fixed for the 7th of June. Life seemed to him once more bright and beautiful, and all his old gladness came back to him again. One day, however, as he was going over the house in Curzon Street, in company with Lady Clementina's solicitor, and Sybil herself, burning packages of faded letters, and turning out drawers of odd rubbish, the young girl suddenly gave a little cry of delight. "What have you found, Sybil?" said Lord Arthur, looking up from his work and smiling. "This lovely little silver bonbonniere, Arthur. Isn't it quaint and Dutch? Do give it to me. I know amethysts won't become me till I'm over 80. It was the box that had held dear Conatine. Lord Arthur started, and a faint blush came into his cheek. He had almost entirely forgotten what he had done, and it seemed to him a curious coincidence that Sybil, for whose sake he had gone through all that terrible anxiety, should have been the first to remind him of it. "Of course you can have it, Sybil. I give it to poor Lady Clem myself." "Oh, thank you, Arthur, and may I have the bonbon too? I had no notion that Lady Clementina liked sweets. I thought she was far too intellectual." Lord Arthur grew deadly pale, and a horrible idea crossed his mind. "Bonbon, Sybil? What do you mean?" he said in a slow, hoarse voice. "There is one in it, that is all. It looks quite old and dusty, and I have not the slightest intention of eating it. What is the matter, Arthur? How white you look!" Lord Arthur rushed across the room and seized the box. Inside it was the amber-coloured capsule with its poisoned bubble. Lady Clementina had died a natural death after all. The shock of the discovery was almost too much for him. He flung the capsule into the fire and sank on the sofa with a cry of despair.
End
of Section 2.